Manage our expectations. Good morning. First of all, I'm a very informal presenter, so hopefully all of you can hear me. I don't love microphones. I normally walk and pace, but I am wearing a boot. That is not the result of an IMC process gone bad. It's literally the result of too many conference calls. So before we jump in, I want to ask how many of you have seen what's going on with REI? Okay. I think this is going to be a fascinating case to watch. So for those of you who have not heard, it's sort of a real-time integrated marketing campaign. They announced last night, and they started with their customers, that they are not going to be open on Black Friday. They are going to close all of their stores, pay their employees, and encourage everyone to opt out and go outside. In addition, they're putting that message on their online site. So they're not going to totally shut down their online venue, but when you go to REI on Black Friday, it's going to encourage you to basically not to shop and go outside. So I think this is an interesting real-time IMC because how they're doing it both through their direct communications to clients. The media coverage obviously as it started. I want to see if they're going to follow through with some advertising and how else they're going to promote it. They may not have to because honestly they're getting so much buzz about it online already as well as in the earned media coverage. They may not even have to do advertising, but it'll be interesting to see if they take it to another level, elevate the challenge, and see if they can get other people who have similar missions to go out there, whether they're some of their competitors like Patagonia, et cetera. So I just think it's something to keep an eye on and see how this plays out. It's a very expensive campaign in terms of what it costs from a business standpoint, but at the same time, when you think about it, what it costs from a marketing communication standpoint, it's very minimal. So not to give you homework, because I'm sure you guys have enough work to do in your regular lives, but I think it's going to be something that is going to get a lot of buzz. I think Fortune's already written an article about it this morning. Now, they are also not a publicly traded company, so they obviously have some freedoms that publicly traded companies do not have. All right, so how many of you have participated in an IMC process, either as a client or as an agency person? Okay. How many of you identify yourselves as public relations experts? Social media, advertising, marketing. Okay, all right. So I'm obviously from a public relations agency, so when I go through this, know that I'm gonna go through this presentation with a bias. But that is right there at the beginning of the downfall of the IMC process. So this is called Inspiration for IMC. And yes, we want everyone to be very inspired about it, but we're also gonna talk about some of the barriers and how to make the process better. And the reality is it's a human process, and so we all bring our own biases to it. And when it's an agency situation, there's also a competitive nature to it that really can impede the process. So the reality is I also define IMC both as a process and an outcome, and I also don't think there's a finish line. I think with a lot of things, people think there's a deliverable and then you're done. With the way communications is evolving, even when you put a campaign out there, it's never done because once consumers take it, co-opt it, and start using it themselves, you have to be able to flex and adapt your communications. I think I work with so many different clients in the IMC process, and I will tell you this, not one of them is the same. Every client has asked me if I can share better examples from other clients on how to do the IMC process. I had one client that instituted a 12-step process, and no, they did not see the irony in the 12 steps to the process, and that was their simplified version. They were so excited to roll out the 12-step process. But the reality is it's never the same, and every time you start it, and I have a client who tries a new process every year, so even when you think you've finally understood the next process, next season of planning, they've decided they want to improve it and do it better. So that to me is why it's never a finish line, because there's always going to be improvement. There's always going to be a different approach. And frankly, when you're an agency, there's always going to be different clients who want to make it their own and personalize it a little bit. So we're going to start here, and I'm not sure you guys are going to be able to read this, but most of you know Airbnb. And their CEO and CMO are very strong advocates of the IMC process. And really here, what they talk about is they have to set the lead for it. And a lot of times what happens is a client will call you together, and they're going to say, here's our brief. Go IMC. And they completely remove themselves from the situation. They remove themselves from the conversations, and that's where it sort of becomes the free-for-all that most of us understand as the IMC process. And here, this quote from their CMO, Jonathan, really talks about how it's incentivizing people to work together and that they themselves have to set the standard and really show the behavior they want their agencies to model. He uses the phrase lean in, which I know a lot of us take in a totally different way. But the reality is what he really wants to do is show that how you behave in the IMC process as a company, whether you're an association, whether you're a corporation, whether you're a nonprofit, really shows how you want your agencies to behave. And frankly, that behavior is going to improve the outcome of the IMC process. A lot of times, okay, let's just hypothetically do this. So a client briefs you and tells you they have a, I'm going to use round numbers, $25 million marketing budget. And they brief you. And you have a social agency at the table. You have a digital agency, because that's always fun when they separate those two. You have a shopper marketing agency. You have the PR agency, and you have the advertising agency. What are you all thinking right then? Exactly. So what does that immediately put everyone on? On the attack or on the defensive? So it becomes this, and by the way, it can be a lot of fun. But that's the thing. So then if the client removes themselves from the situation with no guidance, and let's be honest, they've thought this through. They know exactly how much they're going to spend on those different disciplines, but it's so much more fun not to tell us, isn't it? So then we're all like, all right, we're going in here. And then what happens is when someone throws out an idea, what does immediately everyone do? Attack it. It's the worst idea ever. Why? Because it wasn't yours, and it's not your discipline. And suddenly, $25 million is evaporating. So, the reality is there's a lot that needs to happen, and I understand why. And a lot of companies, and I've talked to some clients about this, they believe that competitive nature brings out the best ideas. That's because they actually don't see what happens when they're not in the room. They don't hear what happens on the conference calls. And they don't hear they don't see what's going on in those meetings when the agencies are by themselves and ideating. And let me tell you, there are times, and there are some IMC partners that I would work with 100 times over. They're great, they're collaborative, they get it. The best thing I've ever seen someone do in the IMC process is be like, you know what, that idea makes sense. Our discipline doesn't make any sense for this brief, and literally excuse themselves from the IMC process. But that made everyone stop. Because imagine, they just went back to tell their bosses that, by the way, I just gave up a piece of the pie, which I'm sure is going to go over really well. But everyone in that room respected them, and the clients respected them. And they had reasons, and it made sense when you thought about it. But instead of just continuing to fight for a piece of that pie, they knew when to excuse themselves because it didn't make sense for the client. So a lot of this is behavioral. And I will tell you, one of the best people I ever hired had a degree in psychology and no background in communications whatsoever. So what are some of the best practices? And again, this is very much from a PR perspective, but I think a lot of this applies to all of it. The reality is it's all about a story. So whether you're doing advertising, whether you're doing social or digital, what sometimes we forget is that consumers, and if it's not consumers, whether it's investors, whatever your audience is, only has one experience with your company or brand. They do not divide it by discipline. They do not say, I understand this company to be this from advertising, and this from PR, and this from social, and this from digital. It's one experience. But when we're coming at it from a fractured mindset, we're not necessarily telling the comprehensive story of either the brand, the company, the new product, because we're only looking at it from our discipline. So I obviously from a PR perspective, we always want to be about the story, but I would challenge everyone, regardless of your discipline, to really be focused on the story and try as much as you can not to try to approach it from your discipline per se, but really approach it as how is the consumer going to interact and engage with the brand and the way we're telling our story. A lot of times, generally speaking, advertising comes in, and advertising is generally the lead on IMC. I've been in other experiences where shopper marketing has been the lead, but traditionally advertising is the lead. Now, some of you know advertising is not the most flexible in terms of just simple production time. So some of the challenges with that, and I've seen a couple clients really try to change that process a little bit, is putting social digital. And in one case, we had shopper marketing in the lead, which was also interesting. But certain disciplines can't be as responsive. So the challenge is if advertising in the lead, and they're like, we've got this great advertising campaign, and this happens a lot, where they're like, here's the advertising campaign. What can you do with it? And sometimes you're like, nothing. Because I don't even like it, or I don't understand it, and I don't get like why we're doing this. And sometimes people will come to us, and I love this. we've got this really great marketing idea. We're going to do a Super Bowl ad. What can we do with it? Okay, let's talk about how, so the challenge is sometimes they come at it sort of with the wrong perspective in terms of an advertising campaign is not necessarily an integrated marketing campaign. You can't necessarily take an ad and build an entire campaign around it. I guarantee it will all happen to us. We'll all be asked to do it at some point. Good luck. It actually can work as long as they're willing to flex and sometimes edit, modify their advertising campaign. The challenge is, again, that takes sometimes months to script, to cast, to film, to edit. And in the meantime, everything else is going on in the marketplace. So by the time that ad actually is ready, the competitors have done something that this doesn't respond to. The marketplace has changed. There's a new product in the marketplace. So that's why a lot of people are starting to maybe not have advertising lead. The challenge is then advertising might be totally separate, which I also think is a miss. So I don't have all the answers, but I do think it's up to us to challenge the process and come to it with some different perspectives. This is also the other thing is I think sometimes walking away, as I mentioned earlier, is really important. Sometimes people are so anxious to do things that they're like, we can do this, and we can do this, and we can do this. My direction to all of my teams who work with me are, I would much rather you do fewer things smarter, better, than try to do everything and cut it down. And this is what happens a lot of times. So you've got your $25 bucket or $25 million bucket. So you know what? We love the plan you submitted, and we know it was $5 million, but we're going to give you 2.5. And by the way, no one does that anymore. But for this process, 2.5. So can you come back and show me how you can do that program in 2.5? The answer is you can't unless you really, really sandbagged your budget and padded it. So what happens a lot of time is as an agency, you will come back and try to do that entire program for 2.5, and then nothing really does it well because you've skimped here and there. It is so much better, and no one likes to hear this, to say, you know what, we can't do exactly that, but let me tell you what we can do for 2.5 that gives you the same spirit, essence, but really is going to deliver results. But that means some things are going to drop, and you have to be comfortable with that. I promise you, you will be more successful, and I know that no one wants to hear it and no one wants to say it, but trying to really try to do too many things and only do them halfway really nets half the results in the end. The other thing is also what happens is, I again think there's no finish line. So what happens is somebody like, all right, we're going to launch this new campaign. And we have an integrated marketing program. And we're going to launch it, and PR is right at the beginning, and then it's done. And even social and digital sometimes is right at the launch, and then it's done. That's not a campaign. That's an announcement. And I think sometimes people forget that. So the other thing is when you're looking at IMC is, everyone tries to make their biggest bang right at the beginning. So if there's a launch date, if there's a new product available, if it is a new advertising campaign, they really try to make the IMC, all the deliverables, hit right in that first week. Well, guess what? Something else could happen during that first week. It happens all the time where something takes over the news. The challenge is, if you do it all then, you run a lot of risk. The other thing is you're not maintaining a relationship with your consumer. And if it's truly integrated marketing communications, your goal is to actually create and sustain a relationship with that consumer. It's not just a one and done. Otherwise, it's like one date and they never call you back. All right, so what are the roles for comms? And this is the fun part, which is where when you guys are presenting ideas, and I had one experience where the client really disliked the IMC process so much that what she announced was, we're going to brief all the agencies, and so there were about 45 of us in the room. And at the end, she announced, we're actually going to put the advertising agency in charge. So all the other agencies are going to come back and present their ideas to the ad agencies. The ad agency is going to decide what goes into the IMC program, and then you'll all come back together. And I love your facial expression right now, sir. Well, imagine how all of us are in the room like, really? We're going to look like team players, but what? And then you're going to come back to the advertising agency. You'll present. The ad agency is going to decide what actually gets presented to the clients without revealing the client's name. And I love them. So we did this. So we were taking all our direction from the ad agency. We were seeing our ideas just killed left and right. Like it was a massacre. Like we were throwing ideas, and they didn't like them. And they didn't like them because it didn't fit in with the advertising concept they had in their head. And so then we're talking to the other agencies on the side. We're like, how's it going with you guys? We're like, we're dying here. Like, this isn't going anywhere. So we finally get to a place where they've sort of accepted some of our ideas, and they put it together. And then we pitched to the client, and you could tell in the client's face. So you'll love it. It's like a U-shaped room, and the client and the ad agency are all here, and the rest of the agencies are on the side of the U, and we're getting up and presenting, and you can just see the client's face. And she's trying so hard not to let it show, but it's a little bit like your face. And it was like, where did this come from? Like, you could just see. So then there's almost no feedback, which never happens, right? And they're like, okay, we're going to get back to you. Then all 45 of us are summoned back about a week and a half later. And the ad agency's no longer at that side of the U. They're back on our side. And what happened was the client said, listen, I don't know what happened. You guys went off briefly. And of course, none of us are going to be like, because you put the ad agency in charge, unless it fit in with their ad concept, they didn't want to hear it. And frankly, their ad concept wasn't quite on brave. So we ended up getting all sent back to the drawing board. But imagine those dynamics when the lead agency is now back on our side. And by our side, I mean literally in the trenches with us trying to come up with a new plan. So you really have to question and evaluate. And you have to do it in a very collaborative but constructive way. Because sometimes, and I'm sure this has never happened to you guys, in a meeting where someone falls in love with their idea. It's brilliant. Really, like it's the best thing ever to happen to marketing. And you're just looking at them like, yeah, but that targets men, and I'm pretty sure our audience is women, and okay, we'll just go with it. And you just don't want to be that, in an effort to be collaborative and be a team player, you almost don't want to question it. But the challenge becomes you end up delivering something at the end that is so off the mark that think about how much time you spend on the IMC process is wasted. So you have to develop a rapport. And I would say one of my tips off the record is to develop relationships with the people you're working with, even though they're not your client. I treat the IMC partners like they are clients. And yes, it requires extra work. And yes, if you're an agency, it probably doesn't fall under your retainer time or your budget. But it's so important to be able to have those conversations and develop a relationship rather than just coming together during what can be technically adversarial. So if you get a plan and they said, this is great, now you all have to come back and it has to be a total of this, you're all trying to cut simultaneously, which also happens. No one wants to give up theirs. So, you've got to have a little give and take. Again, that's where psychology is there, and lead with the behavior you want others to sort of lead with as well. Always create assets in a newsworthy message track. It's not just about the media coverage for us, it's about influencers, and I think all of us know how important influencers are today. The reality is sometimes we don't even do earned anymore in terms of media coverage. We really just rely on influencers to spread the word. So you really have to create assets and a message that makes sense to the influencers. And in this case, I also strongly suggest including influencers in the IMC process. If you have relationships with great influencers, include them. Bounce ideas off them. Ask them what they think. Ask them if it's something that would engage them. They'll be honest with you because they have absolutely no skin in the game. The other thing is, and it's funny because I think this always is a pendulum and it sort of swings back. I remember many years ago when I started at Portland Valley, we had someone come to us, and it was a great client. It was an association of corporations, and they were really trying to rehabilitate the image of the steel industry. And plastics had been just kicking their behinds, right? And so we were doing all of this cutting edge stuff, like stuff that had never been done before. We were loving it. Then we get to the board meeting. So not only is it the comms group of the association, but it's all the boards of the steel company. So we're sitting there, and at the end they go, where's the clip book? And we hadn't thought to do it. Like, this is cutting edge. Like, we're doing this. And I remember one of the leads of the account comes back to our office later and goes, all they wanted was a clip book. And it's a reminder to us, and we always chant it to ourselves every once in a while, is at the end of the day, especially again, this is my PR bias, they still want to know what media coverage you've generated for them. Because it's important to them from a reputation standpoint, it's important to them from a stakeholder standpoint, and it's important to them from an investor standpoint. So as much as we love all the other stuff, it's making sure you're packaging those results. But for us, a lot of times it's coming back to earned coverage is so important. And we have an association now that we work with, as well as, I think it's fair to say, I work with Hershey's. Obviously, Halloween is kind of interest to them. So, the reality is they do great work across the board in their social digital. And at the end of the day, they still track media coverage with the most precise. If you could see their dashboard, it's phenomenal. You can do day by day, you can do by week, you can track it from comparison over year, but it's about penetration of your message, the outlet, it all ranks it, and it's fantastic. It does amazing algorithms for you. But at the end of the day, it's still extremely important to them. And in the case of Hershey's, for a variety of reasons, that's actually more important to them to social media in some cases. And for those of you, how many of you ever worked on risk or corporate issue management? Okay. Not one of my favorites, but we'll be drawn into them even if it hasn't been. Now, I know there are those junkies who love it and only do issues management, and God bless them. Like, I do not want to be on call 24/7 every time something bad happens, because that's what happens. But the reality is you do have to have that conversation, and even during the IMC process, again, great ideas come up. Okay, I'm going to assume we're not going to really talk about this or tweet this part. We had a client come up with the idea they really wanted to use Mike Tyson in an ad. It's a great idea, right? Awesome idea. And so here we are, like, could we maybe talk about how people would respond to that? Can we talk about the fact that, no, this is brilliant. It's going to be groundbreaking. It's going to grab so much attention. You're right, it is. It's going to grab some attention. Can we talk about whether it's the right attention? No, this is going to be something we've never done before. And I'm like, and it might not be something you ever do again. So in the end of the day, we ended up, ironically, not our idea, but we ended up on the phone with the CEO with literally a risk assessment that we had to walk them through on whether it was or wasn't a good idea. And at the same time, it made perfect sense for the target audience. He was on his comeback. Like, it made so much sense. But for this company, for their stakeholders, and for their investors, it was maybe the worst idea I had ever seen or heard of. But we had to defend it. And again, between us friends, the ad agency kept pushing it to the point where they scheduled the ad shoot, even though the CEO wasn't on board. So I had this call the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and the shoot was scheduled for the first week of December. And it ended up, what they did is ended up scrapping that and filming ads with 2 alternatives. Imagine the cost of that. So, and so this is where you have to defend. But this is the problem, and I always say this to my team, because of this role that we play, which is critical, we become such the Debbie Downers. We are like the dream killers. Like, do you know what I mean? So you also have to balance it, because you want to be known as creative and smart and strategic, and all the time on the calls you're like this. That's great, but can you imagine if the New York Times gets that? So you literally become the life suck of any call. So you really have to balance it. And sometimes we literally mute the phone and are like, you play good cop, I'll play bad cop on this. We'll take it from there, because then that way only one of you is the life suck, not the entire team. But be prepared for it. And if you love to do worst case scenario planning, just run with this one, because it's going to happen. Anytime there's a worst case scenario, you have to be prepared for it. The minute you're not prepared for it, I guarantee it will happen. All right, so again, this is just a little bit about the earned, and in terms of PR. I also think this is going to be an interesting debate as we move forward about what earned is, because if it's earned in magazine, print, broadcast, everyone totally understands where it is. But if it's earned where a great blogger who is spot on in the right audience for you and the right influencer writes about it, is it earned from a PR perspective? Is it earned from a social, et cetera? So this is where a lot of times you will see PR agencies and social agencies doing a little bit of this at the table. And I think right there, and I love this, stay in your swim lanes, et cetera. Part of the IMC process is really understanding what you're supposed to deliver on. At the same time, I will also say, how many in the room, like when you hear direction, follow the direction perfectly? I'm actually really proud of you, because I think part of the time what it is we do follow direction perfectly. And we stop exactly where we say we stop. And then we get on the phone and our mouths are hanging open, because we're like, but that's not what they're supposed to do. They went outside their swim lane. What? And they end up getting the idea, and frankly, they end up getting that chunk of budget. It also happens in new business presentations too, where you're like, but they didn't ask for that. They asked for this. Well, guess what? If you just give them what they asked for, a lot of times you're going to end up losing. But so many of us literally check the boxes because we don't want to offend anyone by going outside of them. This is just very quickly about the fact that earn has a lot of credibility, and this is frankly really about paid. So when they're trying to determine their spend on paid versus earned, there's a debate about what should be the right split. And I've had clients who've literally said it's an 80-20. They presented at the World Marketing Conference that they had figured it out, the algorithm, and they were always going to stick to 80%. Oh yeah, 400 of us in a conference room at National Harbor. We figured out the marketing dilemma. 80% broadcast advertising, 20% whatever else you want to do for your brands. So the irony is 2 years later, they've decided that algorithm doesn't work. And you might be surprised that the person that announced that at the conference is no longer in that role. But the challenge is when we think about it, how many of you actually, when you go to YouTube, watch the pre-roll? Or how many of you, as soon as it says skip ad, can skip ad? Exactly. I mean, that's the challenge, is you really have to get that earned. And I think in a way, it's really making it even more relevant today than it has been for a while, because we have so much control. DVR, when you DVR a program, how many of you watch the ads in between? Exactly. So it's putting really the information back in the control. But if someone picks up a magazine to read a magazine or a newspaper, whether it's on their device or whether it's in print, they're purposely choosing to read that information. They're selecting it. They are their own curator of information, which means you have to be the places where they're picking it up, which is why we use some of the same tricks that advertising agencies use, which is where do people watch, et cetera. But then what we do is, instead of buying ad time, what we try to do is make sure we've got a story that will hit one of those outlets. But this just really gives you quickly a rundown of where the trusted sources are. And you'll see, again, influencers still remain really, really critical. So you need to understand not only where your consumer is, but where their influencers are for the earned. This is a little bit more of the influencers. And it's scary to admit that YouTube stars have so much more influence than celebrities. Here's the good news. They are significantly less expensive than your traditional celebrities. So there is a bonus to that. And I think you have a lot more flexibility. The blogosphere, and the reality is, we all know no one's telling stories just in black and white anymore. It has to be visual. It has to be really impactful. And the visuals really have to be part of that storytelling. You can't tell a great story and not have visuals that accompany it. That means photos, that means video, that means the whole thing. And the reality is, now, when you get a story out there, it's no longer like, that was a great hit, we're done. Guess what? Now you have to monitor all those comments on the story and be prepared to react, because sometimes you can get attacked by activists. Because here's the great news. Activists have a great time online. They love it. And so remember when you were talking about issues and reputation planning earlier? Always plan for the activists. And you'd be surprised at some of the things you do. I mean, we just launched a global CSR program. Like, what could possibly be wrong about that? You're feeding children in developing countries. You'd be surprised. There's a lot wrong with that, apparently. So that's where you really don't get a stop again. It's not like your story's out there, it's done. Whether it's an advertising campaign, et cetera, there's always going to be an ongoing conversation, because now that's what consumers get to do. And there are the consumers that do it, there's also your investors, and there's your activists that do it. So that's what you really have to monitor. You have to be willing to really talk about the story, and that's where your influencers become extremely important. And frankly, they can get out there a lot faster than anybody else. They can. So having your influencers prepared, and that means, so if a story hits and something comes out and somebody presents data that contradicts what you're saying, is one of the first places I always recommend you go, is go to your influencers first. Brief them first. Because they can get out, as long as they've got the correct information, they can get out there faster than any of your other channels. Because what we haven't talked about is the infamous legal, which they're awesome. Make friends with them too. One of my best tricks is when I send documents to review at illegal, I sometimes send coffee and bagels. Helps tremendously. Don't use that against me though. Okay. Here's the other thing. They give credibility, they can endorse a brand, but they also can mobilize your consumers in a way that you can't. Because if someone follows a blogger or an influencer on YouTube and they activate you and ask you to do something, you're a lot more likely to do it than if a brand comes and says, we would like you to tweet about this. And you're like, I'm not doing your work for you. Now, of course, we're a jaded group, let's be honest. But there are consumers that are just as jaded as we are. They're like, I'm not going to do your work for you. Like, why? What's the reason? But influencers can do it, and they can tell a brand story in their own way. And this is where people get a little nervous about this. But if you've selected your influencers correctly, they can tell your brand story in a way that's authentic to your brand, but still authentic to their followers. Nothing is worse, and you will get called out immediately if an influencer tries to be too corporate-y. They will call you out. So that means they're going to take your documents that you spent months writing, and they're going to change them. And they're going to change them to their voice and the way they write, and it's going to hurt. But it's actually the best thing that can happen to you. Just let it go. It's fine. It's fine. Now, convince legal of that? Good luck, Godspeed. Okay. So these are the questions that we have a tendency to always ask when we're evaluating creative for PR value. So this is, again, remember when we were talking about asking those nice, tough, but collaborative questions earlier in the process? This is literally our checklist, and we do ask all of them, which makes us super popular in the room. But the reality is it actually helps all of us. If we're all in the room, this actually unifies us in what the general ask is. And you'd be amazed. Have any of you ever gotten a brief that wasn't written clearly? No, you don't say. There have been times where we've come back with briefs and it's like their new thing is a one-page brief, which sounds awesome. I don't know what they're doing. So there's a lot of conversation, and I think some people are afraid to, like, this is the brief, let's take it, we're going to use this as gospel, this is going to be awesome, and then you get back and you really read it again, and you're like, I actually don't know what they're asking for. And if you remove all the jargon, it's literally half of the length that it normally was, and so then you really don't know what's going on. So be comfortable asking these questions, and if you don't want to be the only person to ask it, sometimes we divide. We're like, you're going to be the one who asks about the call to action, and I'm going to be the one who talks about the balance between branding, education, and edutainment. And so that way you're not, again, the drain killer. And I think the other thing is sometimes people start going, and it sounds ridiculous, but the most obvious question is, does this really actually hit your target? Which sounds silly, but a lot of times when you get the brief and you start ideating, suddenly you've got this target beautifully defined. There's psychographics, there's demographics, there's social media habits, all this, and all of a sudden you're like, we're not even talking about the same person. It happened last night. I was on a 3.5-hour conference call. Really productive. And we were talking, and I was the buzzkill. And of course, imagine you're in a conference room, and there's some people there, and then there's some people coming through the ceiling from the speakers. I was one of the ceiling speakers. And all of a sudden, I'm like, so can I just ask a question? I thought the insight said that she did this action because she actually wanted, it was internal satisfaction. Like, she did it because she wanted it. But what we're talking about seems to be external validation. So this is what I love. You know what, we're going to deal with that later. No idea is a bad idea. We're just going to come back to that later. I'm like, okay, but we kind of seem to be going down a path of external validation, which seems to be completely contradictory to the brief. Okay, great, we'll come back to this later. Let's continue to ideate for 3.5 hours. So, this is where the target, honestly, is I would always stress people start. But that's just because we suddenly lose them very quickly after all that time. All right, so here are the best-in-class examples. And very few people are ever going to say they worked on a best-in-class example because there's always the process that jaded them. But in terms of the outcome, you have that unified message so that there's not confusion among your audience about what you're selling, what you're promoting, what you're talking about, and there's not a disconnect. Suddenly it can seem like you're talking about a single brand, but because of the discipline, it seems like it has conflicting personalities across the channels. You really have to have the POV in place within pop culture. We all know this, pop culture reigns, especially when you're targeting millennials and Gen Zs. You have to understand where it's going. A lot of misses happen when you've got a deaf ear to pop culture. And I'm just, again, going to be brutally honest. Sometimes you're talking about targeting millennials and Gen Z to people that are not millennials and Gen Zs. How do I say this nicely? And so you're talking about stuff. One of our favorite examples, and we actually won a Cannes Lion for this. I remember. I'm going to get in trouble one of these days. We're sitting on the call, and we were trying to explain who Michaela Maroney was. And this was immediately after the Olympics, right? The Olympics. Doesn't everyone watch the Olympics? And we're having this call with this client, and they just did not know. And we hung up, and I will confess, I said, the most beneficial thing we could do for that client is actually get this a subscription to Us Weekly. Like, it would make our jobs so much easier because we had to defend who she was, explain why she was a cultural icon. This campaign went on to win major awards, but I still remember explaining who she was and why she worked for the brand. Meanwhile, she'd been on the cover of every single magazine. She'd done, I can't even tell you how many interviews, and I'm like, did they just not have the TV on? Did they not get? But that's the reality, and it's something that cannot be understated. again, the peso. And then it's really about a conversation. People fall in love with the taglines, which is great, but if it doesn't start a conversation, it's just a tagline. And I think sometimes that's where we fall down a little bit too. I would challenge this. I think we probably get even more messages in this, depending on how we get our information. And everyone does their own. Again, they self-curate. So how you're getting your messages, whether it's your phone, my husband, I'm so embarrassed to admit, only reads news on Twitter. But he's very well informed, which shocks me to no end. But he uses his Twitter feed as his news channel. And he's not a dumb guy, but I'm just like, he knows what's going on. But the thing is I know he checks that constantly, and that's why he knows what's going on. So I challenge it. I think it's actually more than 3,000. But imagine trying to break through someone and grabbing their attention and keeping their attention. Because here's the thing, you can grab it for 3 seconds, that's great. But in 3 seconds, if you're trying to sell a product, that does not get them to the store and get them through the purchase line. It just doesn't. Of course, you could start using drones, and that's a whole nother story. All right, so the key here, that's why it's so important to have that one unified message that's simple and consistent and translates across every channel. When you're in the IMC process, if your message does not work in a channel, then it means it does not work. So you might say it differently, you might articulate it differently, it might go with different visuals, but it still has to be the same message. All right, everyone knows this campaign. It always starts with the most basic human insight. And who hasn't seen the Dove campaign? Exactly. And the reality is that's why it works so well. It's why it resonates with people, and that's why it starts the conversation. It's not just a marketing ploy. It literally starts a conversation and sustains the conversation. Now, there is debate whether this campaign actually worked from a sales standpoint, and I think that's very valid, but I think there's also, you have to look at this more long term. It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be a spike that week, but everyone recognizes this brand and what they stand for now. So the competition is culture. I'm not sure how many of you watch these shows, but there you go. We need to update the One Direction picture. Sorry. Just noticed they've got all, it's retro. Has all the members. Okay, so how many of you, by the way, I have a client who claims they created Peso. No, seriously? Yeah. But this is how we all work. And the funny thing is, or not funny for website designers, is now there's debate about where websites really truly play, because it depends on how they're designed and whether they're actually allowing for two-way communication. And the websites, some people are moving their websites entirely to the Tumblr platform. And if you do that, suddenly it's sort of co-owned in many ways. So there's some debate on whether that still stays in the owned. And again, the validity of the owned channels versus the other channels where there's more leeway for conversation. And I am really running out of time. Okay, I'm going to skip all of this and go to case studies really quickly, and I'm going to even skip all of this. So some of you may have seen this IKEA campaign. So the human insight here was everyone has this idealistic version of what a morning looks like. You get up, you have your coffee, it's totally organized, right? The reality is it's so not that. And so what we wanted to talk about was the fact that use the human insight that mornings are freaking stressful. They're not this idyllic start to the day, unless maybe it's a Sunday morning. But that it's really this chaotic, crazy, stressful. So how does IKEA then become part of the solve? So we started talking about how you bridge that moment you sort of aspire to and the actual reality. So it's really called the first 59. And it's really about how can you get through the first 59 minutes of your day. And it was a truly integrated campaign, and it went across all platforms. I'm sorry, I'm skipping some of this, but I think you guys have access to the deck. But you can see it went through all of the Peso channels. And the idea here was it started with consumer insights, where we had this insight, but then we went and actually surveyed it. We tested with consumers about what their mornings were really like, and we took some of those insights to inform the content. So we took some of their actual narratives and used it to inform the content, because nothing's better than actually realistic insights. I'm not going to play these, but some of you may have seen them about what mornings really look like. And so the first one is about this gentleman is trying to potty train his son while getting out the door for work, and his wife is also trying to use the bathroom. This gentleman has a lot of daughters, and so when he's looking for, I think, for shave cream, he literally opens this cabinet that's beautifully organized, but it's all girl stuff, and you can tell just by the colors. And so the reality is that is what most mornings are like. And it really took everything and every team member to work through. So they did this all the way from obviously paid banner ads all the way to the in-store experience, so that when you saw about how to organize those moments, you actually could even go in-store and help find the solutions based on the first 59. And that's what made it, and I'm really short-circuiting it and the team would probably murder me, really makes it unified, is because it was through every single touch point a consumer had, whether it was on their app, whether it was on the web, whether it was through influencers, but also once they actually got in store. And a lot of times stores where a lot of the IMC falls down. I think I'm out of time, actually. Aren't I? Is that okay? I'm looking to work. Okay. So I have other case studies, but I'm happy to answer questions. We can talk about any of the CPG ones. The reality is all of them are going to be slightly different. And just because it says IMC doesn't mean that every single channel is going to be represented at times because of the scope, because of the challenge, and because of the opportunity. So, sorry. That was a very biased PR perspective, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And there are additional case studies, and I can make sure the deck is available to all of you, but it takes you through cheese blasters. In case you didn't know, those are Cheeto-covered Old El Paso taco shells. Yeah. You're not the target, any of you. But let me tell you, the target really liked them. And then also Kimberly-Clark, which, I mean, who would have thought that launching designer paper towels? Yeah, it's a thing. And it worked really well, but they use a lot of influencers. So the case studies we gave really gave various levels and in terms of scope as well as scale and the ways they approached it and who the lead was. So does anyone have any questions?